Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Comprehensivist Wednesdays. For today's topic, we are delving into some of Bucky's great ideas. Today's great idea that we're going to attempt to tackle here is the notion and the concept of precession. I will ask you all to please be gentle and kind with me. I'm fairly new to Buckminster Fuller. I've been studying him for just a few years here. So you guys have the misfortune of having me guiding you through, but that everyone and anyone here to go ahead and chime in to help us understand this concept. What I will do is I do have some very, very basic slides here with some definitions and concepts, and I'll share a little bit with you kind of how I understand it, and then we will open the floor up and I'll ask those who are very familiar with Buckminster Fuller's concepts. We call him Bucky here. I do invite you to please type an exclamation mark in the chat, and I will call on you after I say a couple words, say a little bit, to please expand upon the concept and share with us your take, how you see it, what your thoughts on it are. So I'm going to ask folks, if you're not chatting, try to keep yourself muted just to cut back on background noise. And the way to cue yourself to chat is to type an exclamation mark in the chat box. So precession, what is this precession? Let me go ahead and start us here going into this topic. I have, so right, I'm starting with an image. Yes, I guess if I were a bee. I'm putting this up here. We're going to come back to this. I want to start you with this before I inundate you with a whole bunch of words. Note, please, here that this bee has hairy legs. I'm going to explain to you how this ties into precession in just a moment. So the bee has hairy legs. What is precession? So precession comes from physics, and what it's described as is an action that occurs at 90 degrees to bodies in motion. It's a complex motion executed by a rotating body subjected to torque by a conical locus of the axis. That is, the in the mouthful type of discussion, of definition. Bucky expands just a little bit in that, and he tells us that it's the inter-effect of individually operating cosmic systems upon one another. He says that since the universe is an aggregate of individually operative systems, all of the inter-system effects of the universe are precessional, and the 180-degree imposed forces usually result in redirectional resultants of 90 degrees. This seems like a very difficult concept, but let me take you back to the bee. The bee is merely going from flower to flower, seeking honey. But because its legs are hairy, it's gathering pollen and distributing the pollen to all the various flowers that it alights upon. The goal is not to spread the pollen. The goal is to fetch the honey. But its purpose, it's super important to our life and our environment and our entire ecosystem in its purpose of pollinating all these various flowers. So the goal and the purpose are kind of perpendicular to each other because they're not necessarily in alignment. The bee is doing one thing, but you see that this is the side effects of something can be greater than what that single goal is. So that's how I understand Bucky is explaining to us this concept of precession. That's why the bee, I thought that would be a good example for you. If I've totally confused you, I apologize. In C.J. Farnley's website, he has a little section where he takes a couple different definitions of precession and puts them together. He has this physics one, and he also has Bucky's Synergetics one. He also has a quite a detailed selection from Kirby Urner, and I just wanted to throw that up here because it's very detailed, and I think it bears merit in reviewing here. And so the way that Kirby puts it is he says that precession in synergetics shows up as the relationship between two sides of the same generalized principle coin. He says gravity begets radiation begets gravity. Tension begets comprehension begets tension. So he also explains the difference between the traditional physics. And he says synergetics is unlike traditional physics in its insistence on gravity as a circumferential pulling together and thereby implosive, versus a radial explosiveness emanating from the center, a 90-degree relationship. So this is, again, taking us back to the statement that we saw in the previous page, where he's saying that precession refers to nature's way of getting the job done at 90 degrees. Now, he says to human selfishness and ignorance, but I find that you can take out to human selfishness and ignorance and really just throw in several different things there, and it does work. It works throughout many different aspects of our day-to-day. I will go ahead a little later and throw this into the chat for you so that you can read it and digest it on your own time. I just wanted to put it up there because I thought it was important. So in his work, Bucky emphasized the importance of understanding precession as a dynamic and cyclical process. And he said in which a spinning object changes its orientations over time. He saw this as a model for understanding change and evolution and believed that by studying precession, we could gain insight into the patterns of growth and development that underlie the universe. That's a really heavy statement, but it's beautiful in its statement. These bullets down here are ones I pulled out from all of this that we've been looking at for this definition. So the precession effect means that the side effects of an intentional action are often the main event. So in other words, that bee is collecting honey, but the main event is the pollination of all the various flowers, which are vital for us on this whole planet. Bodies in motion operate at 90 degrees angles. So there is this perpendicular relationship or opposition, as it were, in so many things found in nature. And as such, and in many of Bucky's concepts, we look to nature to show us the natural way. So the very last bullet here, beware of the potential impact of your actions, both positive and negative. So Bucky doesn't explicitly speak about positive and negative aspects of precession, but when we look at it and when we go ahead and identify that the overarching theme of what's being said here is that, you have a consequence attached to every action, cannot be divorced. They must go in tandem. This tension begets tension that Kirby Urner expresses in his definition. That is a fancier way of saying exactly this, at least to my understanding. This notion of precession, if we internalize it in our day-to-day and we see that it can be applied for everything, it boils down to this, I don't want to use the word basic, but maybe vital concept, where if we move with intention, we become aware that everything we do has some type of impact. And perhaps in moving with intention, we can attempt to ensure that the impact is a net positive. And that's what I hear Bucky saying in some of these, his very deep models and just more complicated ways of saying it. I am not a physics major, so I'm just sharing with you how I understand it if I'm looking at it and saying, how does this work for me? How does this work for us, for a community? This is the way that I see it. And that's all I have for you. I know it was a lot of words. I apologize. Hopefully it made sense to you. I would like to please invite others to join in, comment on what I said, ask for clarification, and please add on to what I've said. I would love to hear from some people who have been studying Bucky's works for much longer than I have. And so go ahead, Jon, go right ahead, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Marita. Yeah, I think back to my first, when it was first explained to me, and it was demonstrated, and it was a very clear demonstration. What they did is they got a bicycle wheel with a bar for an axis, so you could hold on to the wheel. Holding this axis, imagine a wheel, bicycle wheel turning here, and somebody spins it for you. And now I'm asked to turn the wheel to the left. All right. And when I turn it to the left, it immediately goes over to the left, spins over horizontally. So not only is it going that way, but the precessional effect makes it go that way. Similarly, when we turn it to the right, it can't help it. It really wants to go down. And of course, we all experience that when we're riding a bicycle. We're just not aware that that is actually precession in operation. When we turn, it automatically bends over. So that's a very good way of visualizing the precession that the physics can predict. But I think in a lot of situations in reality, normal situations, precession occurs, but the situation is so complex that we can't really predict it. So this is both the predictable precession and the really hard to predict precession.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that example. That was great. The visual really made sense to me, hopefully for others as well. Thank you. Joe, go ahead.
So I was actually given a handout not too long ago that actually might help out. Can I share? Is that okay?
Please do.
Of course, let's see if I have the handout ready. I hope this works. Hang on.
If you can just minimize your thumbnail, we'll be able to see it. There you go.
So basically, this is just outlined from Synergetics. The part that I really want to focus on is this idea of Bucky's precession right here, where there's 6 movements, specifically 6 basic movements. There's spin and counterspin, orbit and counter orbit. There is all energy is manifested in a vector. So the way I look as a vector is your purpose statement and your goal. So that would be a vector for the B. You have in and out, expansion and contraction, torque and counter torque, and precession is everything in motion all at once, so that it's always going on all at once. So this was put together by Steve Thomas, who has actually attended here on many different occasions. And it directly relates to the tetrahedron as well. Now, the importance of this is that the way I'm viewing it is that if you can relate it to other parts of reality, like sine and cosine, and concave and convex, but there are areas that we're not able to see, that we're not able to grasp. And so that there's the seen and unseen, so that we're looking at things and not necessarily seeing all of reality. And then there's ways of looking at things from a 3D and 4D part of reality. Maybe somebody else in the room could actually help with that. But again, this means that this is just an idea of the motions that are going on at constant. And it kind of relates back to what Jon was saying about the directions by which everything is moving all at once. And that we don't necessarily know the processional effects of some of our actions. So the bee doesn't necessarily know the processional effects of all of its actions. Now, there are elements of the idea that you're considering over longer periods of time, what would be the purpose of something in order to make something sustainable. So let's just say I'm a company, you would not necessarily just focus on short-term profits, you would actually focus on the long-term, and that because you're looking at the processional effects of what long-term what you'd be doing to the environment itself, how that would actually impact the fact that you would your overall purpose, which is being a business. So you wouldn't necessarily focus on the goal of just maximizing profit in the short term. That's another way of actually looking at it within this. But this, I'll put this, I'll go ahead and share this, but these are all synergetics definitions that we can, talk about to some degree. But that's what I just wanted to share.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, these are, and these all align with, some of the things we've brought up before. This is from Synergetics, from Bucky's Synergetics. So it is an expansion on his initial, or on the statement that we read of from Bucky about, the inter-effect of individually operating cosmic systems upon one another. The spreadsheet, those 6 principles are like an expansion and in detailed analysis of that one statement. So thank you for that. I would like to point out from a less technical perspective, this is also showing you how we get to the concept of, the consequences that we may not see in the actions taken. That does a great job of putting it up there, at least to my thinking. It explains how it could possibly be that we're not seeing everything because all of these things are happening at once. And so if, you can't see them all. And if you make the error of assuming that one of them is what's happening, you'll then perhaps be blindsided by something else. Thank you, Joe. Next up, I have Gerald. Go ahead, Gerald. Welcome.
Yeah. Hey, Marta. And Joe, that was great. I mean, so the phrase that I'm aware of is unintended consequences. And I think I put in the chat that, I understand the concept in the built environment of sustainability and all the rest, but I'm curious as to what this looks like in interpersonal relationships, sustainability and all the rest. I mean, you can't replace energy from what I understand. I don't know if I don't know if I actually put the question out there very coherently this evening, but I see a lot of people on here that are, I think, a little more intuitive than I am at the moment. So I'm going to let it at that right now and step off and let the dialogue continue because I want to hear.
Gerald, just very briefly, if I may ask you, can you restate your question?
Yes. Can I restate my question? My question is, what does this look like in interpersonal relationships long-term sustainability?
Thank you.
Yes, and I don't know who Jon Brett's amazing partner is, but I want to hear this.
Okay. Hi.
Hi there.
Hi. You're up.
Hi. Yeah, this is the science of it, or the geometry of it, has always missed me. But after 25 years of corporate and organizational facilitation, which always included Bucky's principles in our work, our life's work, precession was so important. And the best description I could make was the honeybee, because people get that, you know, oh, the honeybee didn't mean to pollinate, blah, blah, blah. But it's a perfect segue into responsibility and unintended consequences. If we can help people understand that everything, not only what they do, not only their actions, but every thought that they have can have the precessional results of what our current systems and mindsets are based on. We've got such obsolete and warped and dangerous mindsets and systems in place right now. It's really important that we as a community start to help people understand precession, because it is through understanding precession we understand that everything we do has a 90-degree impact. And so it's hard for us in this community to believe that things are going on in the world as they are, because it's like no one's thinking about unintended consequences. No one's thinking about, we're going to attack here, and the massive destruction and emergency we're creating at 90 degrees. So it's such an important concept of Bucky's that now in this day and age needs to be simplified so that the average person can understand it. And it's not easy to understand. I mean, I was there in the room when they did the bicycle thing. And it's good because it's visual. But for me, the B still worked better just because of how it was presented. And it was just a flip chart, just the B and 90 degrees. So the question is now, how do we as a community start to help people understand? It was the whole thing 20, 30 years ago with scenario thinking and corporates and these bigwigs saying, well, let's think this through, but they didn't think it through because they didn't understand precession.
So a classic example of interpersonal precession. So Yoshimi says something and I realize she's incorrect. So the temptation is to correct her. So I might have the intention of explaining what is her misconception and what it should be. But then I have to ask myself the question before I correct her. I say, is it more important that she is correct? I mean, that her misconception is corrected, or is it more important that I listen? Because the precessional effect of correcting her might really spin things out of control. So I'm trying to predict the precessional effect of my intention before I commit to an intention.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. So anyone here who knows me for any amount of time knows that intentionality is one of my absolute favorite words to pull out and beat people over the head with. So obviously I'm super, excited with this topic because I can see how it works there. And, another choice word, as it were, would be to look at the concept of interconnectedness. I think that, Bucky looks at precession and he calls us to look at it as an idea for interconnectedness. The idea of precession as a unifying principle can be used to emphasize the interconnectedness of all things and the interdependence of all systems. That's another way of saying, these consequences, right? These unintended consequences, interdependence of all systems. You see it in the physics, you see it in, the math, but you also see it in your day-to-day. You see it in the bee, you see it in nature. So, this can also, this idea of interdependence can also be seen as as an ethical call to action, like urging us to work together and cooperate to create a more sustainable and equitable life environment world. I see it increasing and expanding. And I do have several people here queued up to tell us more. So let's see what others have to say. Next up, I have Masad. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please do correct me.
No problem. I'm Masood, but I think someone else was before me. I
Nope.
think Jon. Okay. Jon, I can
yes. Go ahead, and then I'll call on Katie after you. Oh, sorry, Katie.
Yes, I haven't read the book, so please correct me if I'm making any incorrect statements. So the way I understand the concept is we want to change the world or personal or general level, but not through restrictive attitude, like don't do it, or even affirmative that you have to do it or that. But in a way, we're looking for positive externalities. Like imagine you're a policymaker and you think, okay, how am I going to change the atmosphere of this specific neighborhood? It's not safe enough, or it's not interesting enough. People don't want to live here or whatever. And then you think, okay, let me just make changes to the zoning policies at the city level, so I can attract specific businesses that make the place more attractive. So that's the way I understand. But please correct me if I didn't understand well.
No worries. Today we're looking at an idea, a concept, not any specific book. So not a problem at all. That is, to me, what I'm hearing is you've described a very down-to-earth and realistic example of what we're looking at here for the concept of precision. So thank you for sharing that. I like hearing examples from others because it helps us to solidify the idea and see where we're getting at. Thank you. Katie, welcome.
Thank you. I think my comment kind of relates to what Masood was saying too. Like you have this positive intention in the world, and then there's an unintended consequence. And I think like even Bucky kind of aligns a little bit with Thomas Sowell, who's pretty famous for talking about unintended consequence. And that's my question too, a little bit kind of what Masood is relating. Like, for example, you might know of a negative consequence, but there's always another, hiding negative consequence. Like, oh, you throw a can on the side of the road. You don't, like, I remember when I was picking up some cans and then some spiders had started to live in them too. It's like, I didn't even think about that as a negative. So it's always going to be on the negative side too. There's always going to be something like, well, I thought it was just like a simple thing, but I didn't know about that other thing. So I think that's what Masood too was getting at. What is it? Is it only like if you're trying to enact, like trying to do good in the world, and then there's something, negative that might happen, or I'm trying to figure out whether it applies to both negative and positive.
So, I would point you back to the 6 principles that Joe threw up on the screen there for us, because if you'll remember, it's stated there in Synergetics that this is all happening at the same moment, and it is quite probable that you will not be aware, you will not be able to see them all at the same time, despite the fact that they're happening. And my response to you, Katie, and I invite any others to chime in, the first thing is, let's start with being aware that there are things happening that we cannot see. If you are aware that there are unintended consequences, I think that we're on the right path, even without being able to identify said unintended consequences. Not sitting back in arrogance that you've seen them all and identified them all. I think that's the first step to walking forward with intention and perhaps avoiding some pitfalls of these unforeseen events. Thank you, Katie. Next up, I have Gerald.
Go ahead to the next person. I'm sorry. I said that and I didn't write down my thought at the time, so I don't recall what it was, and we've moved on. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Susan, welcome. Hi.
Oh, hi, thank you. Yeah, I think we've moved on a little bit as well. And Masood said the word that came to my mind, which is externalities. I think of it as coming from economics, and I think how convenient it is for entities to do what they plan to do, and those side effects that aren't appealing, pollution, whatever you want to call it, they can just frame it as an externality. And maybe this is dated, I hope they're not still using that term, but somehow we have to move away, as you say, to a greater openness, a better reframing, that broader responsibility, complex as it is. But I just remember from my economics class how convenient it was to just say, oh, we don't even have to pay attention to that because it doesn't offer anything useful to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
I haven't thought about Buckminster Fuller for a long time, but I'm realizing how much he's influenced my life. And I pulled out the 78 Synergetics folio, and I just had to study it again. But he's talking about in precession the quanta loss, the Richter formations. I guess some of you perhaps have this. I'm just sort of looking it over again. But yeah, thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So externalities are just exactly that. I mean, that's what they are defined as, they're unintended consequences. The scary thing to me is that in economics, you're taught that, oh, they're just there. just we're going to pretend they're not there. That was always a little scary to me. But the one thing about that perhaps might be something we can look at it and gain some insight is that there is still the acknowledgement that they do exist. It can be debated whether or not more needs done, especially in the economics environments. And I would garner that some would say yes, but the acknowledgement is made that there is more happening here than we can see. And so it has to be identified in that idea. But yes, I thank you for bringing that up, because that's another real world example of what we're talking about here, another way to look at this concept. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. I have, so looking at, I don't know if I want to move on just yet, because people are kind of sinking their teeth into this, this one here. I'll go ahead. I'm going to say your name wrong again. I'm terrible. Apologies. Masood.
Masood. It's not an easy name to pronounce.
No, apologies.
No, it's really good. If I may just add something. So externality in economics is actually used to attract attention to all these things that can happen, can be negative, can be positive. It's not to ignore them. It's specifically they're designed to attract regulators. So you think about, okay, these cars going to create this and that. So you create a specific codes, or if I'm sure it's not tonight's discussion about climate change and all different policies that we created, carbon capture or carbon exchange and all of that. So these are actually to help us to better account for all those externalities. But they're not always negative. There are some positive ones, like you can imagine zoning, for some reason I've become more interested in the city design, for zoning, that you force these builders when they're developing an area to create a small pond and some green areas, and that can in fact help them in raising the prices. The housing prices will be higher. So they have, so this is again the goal and purpose. So their goal is something else, higher prices, but you have this positive consequences that if you're living in an area which is susceptible to flood, that can be a good place to attract, and also other positive thing as a green space. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that's great. That's the that brings us to also back to this idea of the responsibility and accountability that is inherent to the concept of precession as defined by Bucky. It's the this idea of, and I'm shamelessly reading from my notes here, just as a spinning object precesses in response to external forces. And we see that clearly in some of the more technical examples that Joe put up on the screen for us. Just as that, our actions too have consequences that ripple outwards and affect the world around us. So it's this idea of, it's the ripple effect, almost like it makes me think of something I would say to people when we were going through, we were doing a deep dive into some of Michal Csikszentmihalyi's works on flow concept. I was inviting folks to remember that everything you touch touches something else. And that's what we're seeing here. When you have if you're focused on your goal and you're doing this, even in something like zoning, or, that might seem more straightforward, but even that is going to have all these ripple effects. And there's people that you won't see, like even there may be ripple effects that you identify. And then there's ripple effects that you identify and work on. And then there's going to be ripple effects that you may vaguely be aware of, but then there's going to still be some that just didn't hit your radar screen. They're still going to happen. And I think that's the idea of all 6 of these principles, these motions, these movements are happening at the same time. And even though we're not seeing them all, it's not a matter of considering it like, oh, this is absolute failure. It's a matter of, if we're, walking forward with intent and being conscientious about the process, then we have a better grasp on some of the externalities without, better actually than you would have if you were only looking at the one. And I really like the, you said the goal and purpose. In my mind, I see it as the graph. You have the goal and the purpose, and it's tangent. It's not tangential, but the purpose is not your goal, but it is almost the more impactful event that happens in the resultant outcome of this process. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I really like the, day-to-day real life examples. Go ahead, Asher, welcome. Asher?
Hello, everyone.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you. I kind of have like a little bit of input and a comment as well as a question. So I'm going to try to tie them all together. I like the idea of getting everyone involved in this, right? And immediately that makes me think, well, first of all, how? Because first you have to stimulate people's interest. And it's been my experience and observation that like the best way of doing that is usually to get someone to understand how this is beneficial to them or in relevance to them. And I'm an artist and I tell stories with pictures. And so I think immediately, like even like writing scripts and things of that nature, how does this relate to the human story? How does this relate to our stories as humans in relation to like, okay, what would be your 180-degree point and what would be the 90-degree point, you know, and how does this contribute to what it is? What is your personal myth and where are you going? What is direction and what is up or down in relation to what has been your experience? And then when we come back to, okay, you know, the 6 kinds of movement, how might those 6 kinds of movement, I don't know if this has been explored or not, so please, if anyone knows, tell me, let us know. But how might those 6 kinds of movements relate to aspects of human consciousness? So, i.e., breathing, thinking, physically moving, or even just sensing things with the 5 different senses like touch, taste, smell, sight. Also, that we could actually make this thing a lot more objective when it comes down to like, okay, after we bring awareness to the situation, what things that contribute to our ability to be aware actually would allow us to hone in on how to maybe be a little bit more objective about these things that are so subjective in a material sense that we probably like lose sight of how it becomes relevant to us in our day-to-day lives, or in those moments where we're kind of seeing the ripple effects, but like you said, those things that we don't get to see, to understand that as being an integral part of our environment, that perhaps as human beings, we could still sense them somehow if we also worked on these other senses or sensations that we're able to perceive, and maybe it could be delivered through these other ways. That's all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Asher. So, I think some of that is what we've been seeing here. And just to kind of tie it in a little bit with some of what we have, we do have in Synergetics, Bucky specifically states, he says, orbits are regenerative feedback circuits. So these 6 principles, the spin and counterspin, orbit and counter orbit, the vector, the energy manifest, the in and out, the expansion and contraction, and then the torque and counter torque, those are mechanisms, they're happening all at once. So if maybe for us, the key is to acknowledge and to remember that this is always happening. So it's not, as you're saying, is how can we engage this in other things? I think the very first step is to be aware that this is already happening. It's just a matter of acknowledging it and then moving forward with that knowledge firmly in hand. I think that oftentimes some of these concepts, it's so easy to view them as external to what we happen to be doing in the moment. And I believe that Bucky is inviting us to view this as internal and external. It's all around you, it's inside you, it's above you, it's behind you. And so with that, you're going to then get a sense of the inescapability of it, which I really love, because we should never be able to escape the fact that unintended consequences exist perpetually. They just do. And so the precession, it's the effect of bodies in motion on other bodies in motion in interrelationship patterns, right? So what is every interaction you have with everyone and everything but an interrelationship pattern? It ties in that manner. Please, guys, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to add on to answer Asher's question. I invite other perspectives. Oh, did you have a follow-on? Go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of I like where you went with that, and I guess another comment that makes me think. I do a lot of meditation, and a lot of things were like happening while you were speaking, and it's like, I'm so sorry. Give me 5 seconds. It's kind of leaving me. It makes me think that to just study the system itself and then to contemplate on it, to allow the movements to kind of work through you, to feel them, is something. And I saw your comment down here, Joe. Thanks for saying that, because this kind of jogged this thought too as well about the precession being directly related to consciousness. It's like to perceive it, to understand it, what precession is, and then to just allow it to be something that you are aware of and understanding that it's a part of everything naturally opens you to the unfoldment of what it is that it could reveal to you potentially as an individual. I don't know how that will relate to us being able to share it, because it seems like these things that happen in that very liminal space are very hard to talk about objectively, because then we are all perceiving the same thing, but we're perceiving it in different ways. So we have different terminology and ways of being able to communicate it. So this is all very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Asher. I'm going to say one very quick thing, and then we're going to go with Gerald. I would be interested in the concept, exploring a little bit the concept of whether or not it's both subjective and objective at once. Hi, Gerald, go ahead.
Hey, Maritza, just a question. You mentioned orbits are regenerative. Can you go back to that and elaborate, please?
Orbits are regenerative feedback circuits. That is a direct quote from Bucky's Synergetics. That's in the handout that Joe posted for us. It's not in mine, but it's in his. And that's just, it's a statement that is put here in describing the orbit and counter orbit path of traveling. So, you know, to read this one out for you, to give you a little bit more of the background, he's stating that no path of travel may be 180-degree linear in multi-bodied, gravity-cohered, omni-motional universe. The initial reality of all travel is orbital as a composite resultant of all tensive restraints. As the sun's pull on the earth produces orbiting electrons produce directional field pulls. As 99.99% of the bodies in motion in physical universe are operating orbitally, orbits must be thought of as normal. And in parentheses, he puts spinning and orbiting together is dancing. And then he says, orbits are regenerative feedback circuits. And so this is the, and the idea here is that it's, you know, how the orbit is going. So it's a iterative process. He uses the word generative. Does that make sense? Does that help give you a little bit more of an idea of where he's coming from there?
It does. Thank you. As you were quoting that, I was actually thinking about, of all things, I was thinking about stresses on the orbits, and what that does to the regenerative process. But the fact that it seems very positive to me to think about the orbits being regenerative despite outer stresses on them.
I'd like to take us back for a moment to Jon's example of the wheel. So Jon showed us the wheel, and if I get it wrong, please, Jon, jump in. You know, he showed us the wheel and he was saying, you know, it's spinning this way. Now, if you tilt it this way, it's going to lean, right? But if you tilt it back, it corrects. And I think that's the concept there, this correction process, where as when it starts to seem slightly out of control or off kilter, you can adjust. And then there's a signal to you because you'll see it and you can adjust. I think there's that concept involved there as well in this regenerative. And if we take it, so that's the very physics of it. Here we've been trying to look at it from not just a physics, but, you know, a holistic and maybe even a worldview. And so if you look at this from what we were talking about for responsibility, and in, you know, in your day-to-day, then it's the idea of, you know, if you're looking at iterative, even let's look at we were just talking about zoning, right? Zoning, you know, that's a very down-to-earth topic, a day-to-day, you know, almost every city has to deal with this. If you're looking at this concept, the more passes that you do at how this is being shaped out, and the more you look and you try to identify some of these, you know, externalities, then you're going to have a greater chance of being more comprehensive, and so that you're going to miss less the more you do it. So as you go around your orbit again, you're going to see things maybe more well-rounded, slightly more defined, at least as I see it. Please, anyone, feel free to jump in and disagree with me.
No, that's a great way to put it. You always have to review and revise, right? I mean,
And that's the regenerative aspect, I believe, that Bucky was alluding to. Joe, you've read the this paper perhaps more in depth than I have. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I mean, in some way, shape, or form. I think that it's not only including the orbit, but it's also including everything else in that too. Looking at things from like looking at orbit independently is kind of difficult when I think of the idea of precession, because everything is happening all at once. So I think of it as kind of like everything's spinning, everything's orbiting, everything's inside and out, and everything's expanding and contracting at the same time. So everything is this idea, everything happening all at once is it's kind of like a multidimensional way of looking at the world. So yeah, I mean, I think your explanation of orbit was, accurate, but I think it's a very challenging concept to explain too. I'll admit myself.
Thank you, Joe.
So you were also talking about the bicycle and everything. I mean, my takeaway from that was there's this concept of balance and there's a concept of harmony in play here. Would you agree with that? And maybe that's the flow?
Perhaps you're talking about the wheel. So John's example of the wheel. If we're looking at that from a personal perspective, I could see that. I mean, it's the so nature does seek balance. And so if we were talking about how we're trying to emulate nature's way of looking at this, nature is, our example, right? We had the example of the bee. So I think I would agree that would be something that you would be seeking but it might not even necessarily be something to be seeking. It might be a pleasant side effect. Perpetually looking at your iterative processes, because if you're trying to catch those unintended consequences, even knowing you won't get them all, because we've already identified that you can't see, what is it, everything everywhere all at once is what Bucky tells us. But he also says you're not going to see it all at the same time. And we've identified just if you're aware and you attempt, you're going to see more than if you just put blinders on and think you've seen it all. And I think that's, it's a good life goes, as it were. Thank you, Gerald. And thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Maritza.
I'm going to go with Mike. Go ahead.
Okay, what Bucky talked about in processionals is essentially you have a child's top that's spinning. Now, that top sort of wobbles a little bit. Now, that top, if you say that top is the earth, the fact that it wobbles just a little tiny bit and tilts makes the days shorter in the northern hemisphere at night. I mean, in the winter. We're about to approach the vernal equinox in spring. And just a little bit of wobble in one direction makes it the northern hemisphere have 3 feet of snow in Buffalo, for example. It doesn't do 3 feet of snow in South Africa, though, even though you would think the Earth is symmetrical. Now, there's a concept as how that changes from year to year. A little bit of wobble is not the same each year of that child's top. And they use something called the Milankovitch cycles to predict that wobble from year to year. And they could predict what it was 2,000 years ago, and they can predict what it's going to be. So you may have heard that a butterfly flapping its wings in Tokyo can create a change in the weather in Philadelphia. And that is one of these secondary effects. We call them consequential damage, but that consequential effect may be something important. Now, that was really important, and a guy named Richard Friedman, who we've talked about, studied those things in Los Alamos, and was part of the team that created, by just minor changes, created the nonlinear optics that created a nuclear explosion. That was now the non-classified versions of that got imported by a guy named Murray Gell-Mann with Feynman to a place in New Mexico called the Santa Fe Institute. And so some of that is what's going on in our discussion of climate change. Now, there isn't just, when you have one thing, it does, when you change one thing, like you change the interest rate, as Pohl has done to our, it changes a whole lot of things. Changing the interest rate can create a massive layoff in Southern California by similar nonlinear effects. And that science is called nonlinear dynamics. And that's what Bucky talked about in Synergetics. And there's a guy, there's another guy from the Santa Fe Institute named Herman Hacken, who's a 90-year-old professor of that stuff in Germany now, who's talking about that and has published several books, Herman Hacken, and explaining how this nonlinear dynamics and chaos theory works.
Thank you, Mike. That's
Change
great.
one thing and it changes. Sometimes and if you're really good, you can compute that nonlinear dynamic effect and what it's going to do.
Yes,
And
those are fantastic examples of, this idea of how, there's always a consequence to an action, whether we see it or not. It just exists. The fascinating thing about physics is that we come ever and ever closer to trying to pinpoint some of them. Thank you, Mike, for that. Next up, I have Shrikant. Hi, Shrikant.
Hi, Maritza. So sorry, folks, I couldn't make it, right in the beginning. So Maritza, can you give me a recap of what has happened so far and where we are in the meetup?
Oh boy. All right. So we started with bees and we moved on to orbits, and just now we ended with spinning tops, and you're up to date. No, apologies. Sorry, I think I'm funny. Nobody else does. We're trying to look at precession and bring it down to the normal layman's vision. And so I started us off with the idea of the bee and how the bee's goal is to grab honey from each flowers, but it has fuzzy, or it has hair on its legs. And so the pollen sticks to the legs. And as it goes from flower to flower, it's pollinating all these different flowers. And that pollination is like so vital to the ecosystem of our world. That's the purpose of the bee. The goal of the bee is to get honey. And so this is how we explain the idea of the perpendicular relationship of goal and purpose. Joe expanded upon, well, I provided several different definitions of precession from CJ, from Kirby, Urner, from physics textbooks, and from Bucky himself. And Joe threw up Synergetics page, and he walked us through the 6 basic movements of universe per Bucky. And then we gave those as handouts to the group. And then we have had just lively discussion of people far more knowledgeable than I am on Bucky joining. Jon he brought in the great example of the wheel, and he showed us the motions of the wheel, the motion of the wheel and how if you bend this way, it goes this way. So that was, to show the concept of precession as well. We've had a lot of people asking about, how do we bring this into using it in our day? And so we've talked about what we've pulled out as one of the main concepts here is consequence. So action and consequence, and this idea of unintended consequences, and how I like to go back to how Shik sent me Haley occasionally. So we talked about how everything you touches something else. And so what we keep doing is we kind of go far out and then come back in. One of the examples that we come into over and over here now is the idea of zoning in a city. That's our down-to-earth practical example that we're using to show how you can do the regenerative feedback circuits and still miss it. And people here are asking a lot about the idea of those things you see, those things you don't see. So Joe and I have been working to let people know it's okay. You're never going to see it all. But the first step, we believe, is that you are aware that there's things you're not seeing. There are consequences you're not seeing. So that's kind of what we've been doing thus far.
Well done, Marita. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marita. Marita, when I used to run the meetups here in person in New York, we'd get between 60 to 80 people attending, and people would show up at any time. And I was expected to give a 1-minute summary of what has happened so far in the meetup at any point. So that's why I feel for you. This is exactly. But
Oh man,
30 people as they came in.
That's terrifying.
So what I find it particularly useful, because it's always good to kind of keep recapping things, because then you can build the discussion of that. If there are there is one line that I wanted to pursue. I don't know whether this is the right time to do it. What do you think?
Currently, we have no questions on the table,
Okay.
so now's a good pivot point.
Okay, this phenomena of that a person is trying to do something or a system is trying to do something, and it has effects on other things, which it did not expect, it did not predict, it did not intend, both positive and negative. Now that phenomena is a very large phenomena. And there are many, many different ways of thinking about it. There are different sciences which have done that. And I was wondering, what is the strength of all these different approaches as compared to Bucky's approach? Because what we are trying to do here is we are trying to study Bucky's ideas. We're not simply trying to study what he has said, but we are trying to study what he is talking about, what in reality he's talking about. And so it is useful many times to bring in other approaches which are trying to do the same thing. And in the comparison of these approaches, you actually end up learning a lot more, because some of these approaches capture some things better, they approach things in a different way. So for example, whenever I described precession to anybody, two topics kind of came up. One is the topic of chaos theory. Chaos theory does a lot, thinks a lot about this. That's one. The second is the issue of network effects, of saying that, a large network, if something is happening here, if it is connected, you have these long neurons or long economic relations between other things, something happening here is going to change. So one from the perspective of chaos theory and one from the perspective of network theory. Now, I'm not familiar with either of these three, any of these three things, but if anybody is familiar, I would love to hear how they think the idea, Bucky's idea of precession, compares with chaos theory, with the way in which network theory deals with this issue. What are the positives, negatives? What are the synergies between them? So, and any thoughts on that? Would love to hear.
Shrikant, while folks are gathering, oh, wait, we have one. They gathered their nerves quickly. Go ahead, Trevor. Welcome.
Hello. I've been kind of investigating in this area for a while, so I wrote some notes down here. I think the easiest way to approach this is to consider it from the perspective of causality, specifically the causality of human behavior, or why do people behave the way they do as opposed to some other way, like, for example, being nicer to each other, or acting according to our words or our scriptures, be they religious or scientific. We're kind of raised on like our schooling and most everything we do at our jobs and stuff is mostly, it's very strongly bound to the visual physical world, but the causality of human behavior it's metaphysical. So, and with metaphysics, like, it involves things like emotions and this sort of thing. So when things happen, when metaphysically related things happen in the world, like, things involving elections or insurrections and things like this that get people all fired up, there's no way to know what the underlying causality of this is, because it involves grudges, and it involves propaganda, and it involves geopolitical scheming and stuff like this. So instead, what we do is we tell each other stories, right? Because humans like to have a reason for things, so we tell. It's like when you have children, you tell them why something happened because they're not smart enough to figure it out. So you tell them a story. Same thing with adults. Like, if you're managing a country of people, you can't sit everyone down and explain things. Well, they're not explainable in the first place. So we just tell stories to each other. But then, we also tell stories so we can, like, acquire money and power and stuff like that. But anyways, if you look at, strangely enough, if you look at ChatGPT, I don't know if anyone's familiar with ChatGPT, but if you go watch some videos on how these large language models work, like Stephen Wolfram has some pretty good YouTube videos. But basically what they do is they just ingest like just massive amounts of text, facts, things like this. And then it kind of gets processed and chopped up into these little pieces. Some of the pieces are words, some of them are partial words, and then they get stored into this highly dimensional space where concepts are clustered and things like this. So then when you ask it a question, what it does is it basically parses your question, and then it converts parsing converts that into vectors. And then you take that vector and you query the entire data store, and it returns a set of vectors that are related based on a whole bunch of different associations. And then what it starts to do is it just spits out text purely probabilistically. So you'll seed it with a word, you'll start it with the, and then it literally just spits out the probabilistically next likely character. It's literally that simple. And that's how it writes these magical, these awesome essays, and it can draw photos. The way it does that's a bit different. But if you look at people, it's the same thing. Human beings are trained on stories. We watch the news, like we need to know what's going on in the world, right? So the media syncs everyone's internal models of what's going on in the world. So if you ask a person a question and you say, why did this happen? Or you ask them what happened, or why did it happen? What you'll notice is everyone has more or less, there'll be clusters of stories that map to the person's preferred information sources. So what comes out of a human will basically be just, some variation of the same story that they consumed. So basically ChatGPT, consciousness and the stories that come out of it is an emergent phenomenon. The magic of ChatGPT is also an emergent phenomenon. And they both emerge from a hyperdimensional underlying space containing billions of variables. And in the case of humans, a lot of the variables are literally imagined, or they're made up and projected into their minds. So, if you take this pretty simple model, there's a lot more to it than this, obviously, but it pretty much covers everything, I think. Or you can just look at chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, interpret it literally, and take it actually seriously, and you kind of end up with the same idea without all the details. Or in Hinduism, there's the notion of Maya. Reality is an illusion. It's objectively true. It can't be, it's not possible for it to be other than an illusion, because reality comes from people. We're not in reality. Reality emerges from humans, and consciousness makes it appear like we're in it, like we're like the atmosphere of the earth. We kind of conceptualize that as reality, but it's not actually. That's the atmosphere. So I think this is more or less how it works.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Trevor. Appreciate that. Let's see here. Okay. Anybody has anything to say about kind of chaos theory or network theory? Maritza.
Just so I only have, even less of an understanding of chaos theory than I have of Bucky's theories. But, as I understand it, chaos theory is, it deals with the behavior of nonlinear systems that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. So it's studying how small changes can result in drastically different outcomes in the long run. So at the initial onset, it can have large shifts. So it deals with the unpredictability of nonlinear systems, and looks at how even small disturbances can cause a butterfly effect. And Mike brought up the imagery and the story of the butterfly effect, and Joe posted a link to that describing that phenomena. And so we already introduced the butterfly effect to help us describe and understand precession, but that actually comes from Gauss theory. And so it's, the similarities between the two is that they both deal with these indirect effects of complex systems, and precision is looking a little bit more at the side effects of the system's actions, and Gauss theory is looking at the unpredictability of these systems, but they're both kind of suggesting that that potentially insignificant events can have significant impacts on, these complex systems. So, that's kind of how I would kind of compare them and see how they're yoked together. So I just wanted to share that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marissa. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I thought that was a pretty good explanation. So I think that, it's just the ability to actually, I would say with network theory, and the same thing this is with Precession, is that it's looking at the interconnectedness of everything and how everything works together. So it's kind of trying to explain actions within a complex system. That's how I see that particular aspect of it. With as far as chaos theory, it's a little harder for me to kind of see the connection with Bucky's Precession. I mean, the only thing I can think of is that it's difficult to predict in chaos theory. So there's an unseen aspect of what is going to take place, so that things you don't know. So, and I think that holds true in Precession too, that there are things that were unseen that we don't know. That's the connection that I would make.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Now, I know that last time Jon and Yoshimi were here, Yoshimi was saying how important precision is. So I was wondering whether, Yoshimi wanted to elaborate more on that. Would love to hear your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I shared that earlier, my take on the study of Bucky is just so simple and down to earth, because all I want to know is how I can help learners understand the significance of precession in every thought and behavior they express. And if we could help how we communicate this, it's more than just thinking through, it's just, and I think in the last couple of years, what I see is most effective, and having the hindsight of, being locked down for 2 years, is the more the world is now ready for us to link it even more directly, explicitly to nature. And that's where Bucky's strength was, that he knew nature had all the solutions. And people are now experiencing what nature is now offering us because of our misunderstanding or total ignorance about precession.
Yoshimi, let me ask you this question, because you in the beginning you said that's what you're trying to communicate to people, how to be aware of precession. So so what does it take? Why is it that people don't get it? What is it about people who are open to it? What do you have to do in order to be open to it?
We're just living in a time of fear. It's not that it's not that they're not aware, it's that there's just so much fear and distrust that the fear of losing, the fear of being uncomfortable, even the fear of not being able to buy what I want just because I want it, the fear of understanding what ego to eco actually means. People don't want to be told that their ego is getting in the way.
But that's a very, very, very deep observation, because fear, if you look at fear, right? Fear is fear of losing something. And then you immediately start building walls, and you're trying to actually stop attempting to stop the causation of this flow between you and the other because you're afraid that that is going to make you lose something that you have. So it is, fear as a cause of stopping this process. I think that's a very deep observation.
Yeah, I think also it's really a focus. So we tend to focus on the ego, what I want, my desired outcome, instead of trying to look at, well, what does the system need? What does the situation need? And then if you actually start off with, okay, I know sort of what I want, but I'm going to put that aside for the moment. Say, what does the situation need? And a lot of it is out of our direct influence, beyond our direct influence. But there are some things that we can do a tiny bit towards influencing the bigger system, not just what I want, but what the system is, that what I want is within, So you might say, okay, well, we built a house and we wanted a nice house that was self-sustaining. And then we realized after we built it that actually that's not nearly good enough. What we should be doing is creating a house that sustains not only the house, but also the car, and also should be paying more electricity into the grid to pay for the energy that was used to build this thing in the first place. So we started thinking about the whole system. How could we benefit this? How could this house benefit the whole system rather than just us? And that's not a natural thing for us to do, But we've started this. Our latest venture, Emergently, is a tool to try and help you start considering the outside context of what you're doing, because often you can do what you intended to do with a very slight change in focus, and you realize that will have a much more potential for a processional effect that could be like the bee pollinating. Could be way more important than what you're actually wanting to achieve. But if there was a processional effect from doing that, that could be magnificent. And that's just
wonderful. Thank you.
I didn't answer your question. So to be a little bit more explicit, I think if we help, precession is a scary concept for people to try to get to embrace. So I think what's working now is sharing Bucky's definition of our definition of interdependence, because we're finding societies and communities now are having to work collaboratively. They have to, because they're being all flooded at the same time, and they're all losing, the whole community is losing their houses at the same time. Whereas before we could live comfortably and I didn't really need to connect. So now nature is helping us to say, what's the difference? What if we worked interdependently? We could achieve a lot more synergy.
Wonderful. Thank you.
What it means by interdependence is my success depends on your success.
That's our definition.
That's slightly different to, or significantly different to, your success is my success, or my success is your success. No, I'm saying I am not successful unless you are successful. So therefore, there's an interdependence there that I cannot be successful unless you're successful.
And we are not successful unless nature is successful. And
Wonderful.
so there's the link there. That's the natural. My success is your success. Our success depends on nature's success.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Yoshimi. Thank you, John. Next up is going to be Asher, Gerard, and Mike. Asher.
Hi. So I kind of wanted to take it back to where you guys talked about the chaos theory a little bit, and how it's related to precession. My understanding of it and what I heard, and the way I interpreted it was like, and I try to write some things down. Precession observes a structure that becomes apparent within a system of chaos, but it also helps to further perpetuate this system of chaos within the parameters and of all of these things that are unseeable or that cannot be experienced, so to speak, but that we know are there. That there we have the chaos again, right? And then there's the whole idea of like, I forget who it was. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name. Who kind of brought in the ideas of like religion and story, and how as humans we use story to communicate those things that are otherwise non-communicable. And there's the idea or concept that, you know, one cannot be everywhere, experiencing everything at all times, which immediately brings us back to relevance and like the individual. If I am expected as an individual to be, first of all, knowledgeable of this concept, and then secondly, to like make it actionable, how does it become relevant to me and outside of me being able to understand it and it being something that, okay, I'm aware of, I see it, and I might even see patterns as in how it relates to my life. But when I am breathing and eating and sleeping and going through the things such as emotion that help to carry me throughout my day, right? These things, emotion that help create stories in the ways that we communicate with each other. How is it that I make that fit into the grand scheme of a picture, my picture and what it looks like for me right now, so that it can be something that I can constantly return back to in awareness and actually put into practice, so as to be able to hopefully be able to contribute to this butterfly effect in a beautiful way. And for me, this is always something that is just like the drop every time. Is like, it comes back to me being in my body and in my five senses, and, you know, senses that might be otherwise or part of the chaos, so to speak, that we might be able to start perceiving again, or I mean, we're already perceiving them because we're being affected by them, right? It's the reason why we have the lapse or lack in communication, is because we are perceiving these subtle things. They're contributing to the lack of coherence or unity, harmony in our environment, between us and our environment, and between ourselves and each other. So these things are not they're invisible, but they're very much so perceivable because we are still a part of our environment. But again, when does it become relevant? It has to become relevant in such a way where each individual is allowed to be able to understand, how does this relate to me and how do I relate to it, so that I can have to and bring about the change that I would like to.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Escher. Appreciate that. Next up is going to be Gerard, Mike, and Maritza. Gerard. Gerard, you're on mute.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to something Maritza was saying earlier, which I slightly disagree with in terms of the bee's intention and purpose, but the soul of the bee, in my opinion, is survival. And the honey is actually the byproduct, or as we were talking earlier, the unintended consequence. And this unintended consequence is actually a positive unintended consequence, which I equate to bliss. The honey, so for example, for myself personally, I try to get local raw honey on a regular basis. I try to do a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons a day in whatever I'm drinking, primarily for the sake of counterbalancing the allergies. It helps me with allergies. And I hope I'm not swinging too wide here, but my point is, it's not a point. It's my own trying to figure this out. I think back to Buckminster Fuller, and my free association goes then to a modern architect, Norman Foster. And a lot of it comes down to the geometry, it comes down to the laws, the physics. And at the end of the day, it's all about understanding nature primarily and working with the nature and allowing that nature to instruct us as to what the ease of life is, because there's a lot of survival going on. We're all under so much different stress, duress, and for me personally, I'm at a point in my life where I want to understand, what does it take to get from that survival to the thriving nature of life, which is actually an ease, if we can accept it, maybe. Again, I'm still trying to process this myself, but I love the analogy of the bee. I garden, I love to garden, and a very, very dear gardener friend of mine talks to me all the time about start with the soil. You know, there's so much life at a microscopic level going on in the soil that then can create the thriving, surviving first, but then the thriving secondarily, that provides so much bliss. I'm going to use the word to the rest of our life. There was another thought that I had here too, which was that from the geometry perspective, I'm an architect. That's what I do. So I love geometry. It was 90% of my class in high school struggled with geometry, and for some reason I actually looked at it and it was, to me, I feel like sometimes we overthink things, and it's life and nature is right there in front of us, presenting us with all the answers, if you will. So I don't know. I don't have a question. Those are just my thoughts for the evening, and I appreciate everybody's patience for letting me share them. And I appreciate everybody sharing their own thoughts, because it's been very informative and feels very connective. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Gerard. I mean, the simplest way of kind of dealing with these topics that I've seen is that of the Tao, like starting with the Tao, where you're simply saying, look, nature is what it is, and you are open to how it flows. You really, you have some preconceptions about how it flows, but it flows as it flows, and it's like water, the patterns you're not going to be able to predict. They're going to be natural. And when they do happen, they are going to be beautiful, and they're going to be, you'll say, oh, of course, but you're not going to be able to tell how it's going to flow. And so there is that very deep acceptance of nature and its ways, and knowing the limitations, your own limitations of being able to predict or, plan, all of that is held in the context of this profound respect for the Tao. Tao is at once kind of metaphysical and physical. It is the deepest of ideas, and it is all about the actual life around you. So that's the most beautiful way and the simplest way that I have seen of dealing with this topic on a wholesale level. We're going to go with Maritza, followed by Mike. And if anybody else wants to comment, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Maritza.
I wanted to address some of Gerald's comments. So first, in my explanation to Shrikant, I did misspeak. I actually said that the bees were collecting honey, and obviously that's not what they're doing. They're making the honey. Apologies. So I actually, in a past life, I had bees. I was a beekeeper, and so I am intimately familiar with bees and their workings. But the idea here of using the bees as an example for precession is that the single-minded focus, so we weren't, single-minded focus of the bee is to go and make the honey. And you are correct. It's the ultimate goal is for their survival, right? They're making food. So they can take back, so they can have the food for over a winter and such. But the point where what we were trying to invite you to see is that the bee spares no thought to the fact that there's pollen collecting on its legs, and that as it travels from flower to flower, it is pollinating various different flowers. The bee gives no thought to that. And yet it happens, and not only does it happen, it is crucial and vital to our entire ecosystem. That's the point there, where so precession is explaining us that there are all of these unintended consequences. This pollination is an unintended consequence, and it's so important that we go so far as to state that's the purpose of the bee in our ecosystem. Its purpose is to pollinate the flowers, but that's not the goal of the bee. The bee's goal is, as you said, it's sustenance, survival, to make honey. So that's why that example there is presented. Hopefully that clarifies just a little bit. I love the idea of calling honey bliss. I tend to call it medicine. But yes, we can call it bliss as well. It has many, many useful things. It's also a brilliant reminder how nature gets it right for the most part. If we but pause and listen, it gives us pretty good guiding posts. So that was just, and I actually forgot what other comment I was going to make, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Shrikant.
I'm going to have Jon respond. Jon and Yoshimi, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was really intrigued by the idea of bliss, and because I actually don't know what a bee thinks. So Gerald's flip of my original concept of what the bee is doing and why, I think is rather intriguing. That okay, and I relate it back to, when we do something really, we achieve something really good, we often celebrate with a bottle of champagne to express this is the bliss for actually achieving something out there in the system that was really good. And so maybe the bee was actually always intending to do pollination, and it's just a byproduct that happens to, oh, this is great, I got some pollen now, oh wow, let's have some champagne. I think it's a nice flip of stretching the imagination.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jon. I just want to say that human beings are like bees, in this respect. So when you think back upon people who have had influence on your lives, they were just going about their lives. Okay, all of us are going about our lives, but the influence that we have in a direction which is orthogonal to what we are doing is very significant. It could be a chance remark. It could, but more than anything else is the character. Look at the concept of character of people and how influential that it is on others. It just sets the tone. And the effect is very gentle. It is not, many times, most of the times, it's not explicit. The person is not asking you to do anything. It's just that you like how they are conducting themselves, and you say yes to that in your own mind, and thereby pick up. And that those ideas, those ways of being germinate in you, and they produce flowers of their own in you. So it happens it is happening all the time, all around us. So we are, much more powerful bees than bees, let's say. Next, we're going to have, I think Euler has not spoken before. Euler, let's go with Euler. And then we'll go to Mike, followed by Asher. Euler.
So thank you for these comments. The interesting point for me is the bee's intention is just to make honey. That's what the bee's intention is, and it is working within its nature. It's working within the Tao, and it produces a positive outcome. And it's the intentionality behind that is very important for all of our, behind our actions has the effect. That's how you determine the precessional effect. My feeling is that it's intimately connected with our intentionality. That would be my point.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Euler. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike. And Mike, I would love to hear what you got to say about chaos theory.
I was going to try and say how to tie Bucky's Synergetics processional protocol to your comment about network theory and chaos, and bring in graph theory.
Please.
And it's interesting that Euler's equation is also involved in this thing too, as his because he laid out the. It's an interesting choice of a mnemonic because he talked about motions of bodies. The second law of motion of rigid bodies applies to this thing too. Now also Trevor brought in a GPT to explain some of this, and he brought in Wolfram to explain GPT. And an earlier thing, which probably occurred before you came in, I talked about the butterfly effect and Feynman's discussion of nonlinear optics and how that had to do with his nuclear work at Los Alamos. And the Santa Fe Institute was brought into that as to how that ties in, because now by coincidence, Trevor said that the guy who explained GPT to both me and Trevor is Feynman's student, who considered the Santa Fe Institute and Los Alamos as his second home. He was Feynman's lead graduate student, just as Aristotle was Plato's lead graduate student. So the tie-in to all this is that what GPT does is it looks at every single word on the internet, every single piece of code that anybody wrote in GitHub, and some of you might know what GitHub is, and a few more things, and computes correlation coefficients and connectivity and probabilities as to how each word and each collection of words collects with each other. And that is more than terabytes of data. Now, to make that, to be able to find anything in that mess, it lays all these things out on an n-dimensional spherical structure in a graph, in a network. And it is able to hash by a formula that it computes, which is similar to a random number generator, except that random number generators, as some of you know, are not really random, to exactly the right position on this n-dimensional sphere. So it computes what word and what collection of words is next to, goes with every other word. So if I was going to write a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare about Maritza, I would create a question, and it would create a fragment of a graph of a network, and it would match that to although it only right now the free version of GPT only produces a few
Mike,
paragraphs.
let me ask you, how is GPT and how it works connected with Precession, you think?
Precession is the set is a statement that when you have a cause, an OODA loop push, it creates, according to Bucky, 3 other pushes, 3 other causes. According to Feynman in the Feynman diagrams, you shouldn't stop at 3. You have to consider not just 2 sides of every issue, you got to consider all sides of every issue. And compute all those correlation coefficients, and keep in mind that the correlation coefficient is not linear. It's a table. And that is a graph laid out on an n-dimensional sphere, and you hash to the right position to be able to do that. And that's the magic of GPT. And if, although it hasn't been publicized, you can use GPT to write Python code, or you could use GPT to write Excel macros.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Or Shakespeare sonnets, or
yes.
sonnets about Maritza in the style of Shakespeare.
Yes, yes. It does a very good job, actually. You know, I can ask it to write Shakespeare sonnet and say, I don't like that. Let's do Walt Whitman style. And it will do the same thing in Walt Whitman style. And then
You might be able to recreate the Bhagavad Gita too.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it has that kind of alphabet.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Asher. Asher, go ahead.
All right. I love Jon's comment about not knowing what a bee thinks. I couldn't stop laughing for like 2 minutes about that. I wanted to piggyback a little off of that part of the discussion, and also Gerald's discussion about the relevance of the bee and how it kind of what parts of the story in the bee and ourselves are we identifying as being what I'm relating back to the procession, the ideas of procession is where are these movements located at in our lives, and how is it relevant to what we create as story and what becomes individual purpose as it's related to the whole, right? And what can we describe as purpose? Is it what the individual sets out for as a means or ways of survival? Or does it come out of a natural desire that is then interlaced with the idea or concept of survival that is happening simultaneously? How did this become relevant? And then afterwards, the Tao was brought up. I think Shrikant, you brought the Tao up. And you talked about how it says, basically, observe nature. And I love how when we say nature, that it's almost like we're not considering ourselves as a part of nature, as if it is something that is separate from us, or that we are separate from it, as opposed to observing these patterns being observations of ourselves, as if we are looking at ourselves, because that's kind of the conversation that we're even all having right now. It's what becomes of every and any conversations, that we are reflections of each other, and so is a rock or a tree or water that's moving, so forth and so on. So forgive me, but I can only give a personal anecdote as I'm able to relate to this, because this is how all of these concepts are bouncing off of me. in relation to like, how do I put this into play? It's like the disharmony as it's experienced by us as humans is essentially irritation or pain. What is the thing that keeps you from doing what it is that you deem as being the most loving, or yes, as you perceive as the most loving or positive thing in a moment, from one moment to another? It would be that irritation or pain, and it would be related to those 6 movements as you relate to your perception in your inner and outer world and how they relate to each other. But when it comes down to these like full circle moments that we have in life, or the 90-degree angles, right, where there's just like the switch up that kind of allows things to come full circle, or starts to make things make sense. For me, the way I think of it is like, going through life, stumbling, anxious, nervous, just as much as anyone else, I'm sure, messing up on personal life and business goals, things like that. And then it just so happens that I'm at a point in my life where that is kind of starting to change, and I'm getting it a little bit. And it, forgive me, but it appears that the more I've focused on bringing these things local, these senses about myself, to a local point of view, as in my own thoughts, my own breathing, my own body, being able to do that allows me to see the reflection of myself in others and other things, so that I can make the most positive impact in the moment. But also too, if there's something really, really weird happening, my mind feels like it is becoming more universal the less I think about things outside of myself. And it feels this, the only reason why I can say this so explicitly is because I'm now realizing the thing I've been doing through the pain the whole time, which is singing. I like to sing just habitually, has also brought me back to the understanding within myself, right? This is a purpose, an individual purpose now is sparked by desire. I could do anything, but what am I doing? And what do I want to do is probably what I'm going to do. And it's like, oh, I just want to sing, like that, right? Mm-hmm. So, but when I do that, now all of a sudden, I hear everything and I see everything and everyone in a way that it exists outside of any bit or kind or mode of perception I could have possibly had if I was trying to sing to people as opposed to singing to myself.
Wonderful.
If I can hear my
great
voice.
Observation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. The way in which Bucky dealt with it was, he's saying that you have to be your authentic self, that you have to think. And he says, rely on your own experience in order to build it up. Too many of us kind of try to take up kind of parts of others around us, society around us, and just put them on, as if you're dressing with somebody else's thoughts, somebody else's emotions, somebody else's habits. And so what you have is that you have this conglomeration of different things put together, and you're not really an authentic individual. Wonderful. Thank you. All right, folks. So Maritza, what are we going to discuss next in this series? Have you given it some thought?
I have, but I was undecided. I needed to consult you and see what your thoughts were.
We can talk about it. Go ahead.
Yes, I was not 100% sure yet in which direction we wanted to go.
Sure. You want to talk later on offline? We can do that. Or if you want to, okay, perfect.
I will say what I wouldn't mind is hearing if some of our regulars here would want to suggest a topic.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We look for, what are the greatest ideas? So the theme is greatest ideas of Bucky. And we're not really trying to map out everything. What we're trying to do is we're trying to pick ideas that can connect to our lives so that we can see how Bucky thinks using this set of ideas. And hopefully this network of ideas will keep growing month after month. And it's going to integrate with all these great presentations that we are doing. So before anything else, I want to tell you this Sunday, we're going to have lightning talks. So anybody who wants to talk about any idea of Bucky or anything connected with Bucky gets 5 minutes to say their piece. We will have many people talk. And after everybody has had their say, I strongly recommend you to use this advanced technological device called pen and paper, which is amazing. It's like you think of things in your head and you can get it out there and it remains there, no matter, even if you think about something else. And you can organize it and you can see what is the relationship between things that you've thought. And it remains there and you can come back to it. So it's just amazing. So I recommend that you use that to keep track of all the observations that you have about everything everybody has said. Now, you could talk about something very, very simple, or you could talk about something very, very complex. It doesn't matter. Choose anything that you want to talk about. But I invite everybody to speak, because that's the best way to actually listen. Because when you're trying to speak, just the effort of putting something in your own words will force you to have a clarity, force you to think about how can it be objectively understood by somebody else. And then after having said that, you will hear the comments and questions from other people. So it's an amazing experience. So don't miss that. So that's coming up this Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern time. So folks, suggestions about ideas, go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to put an idea on the table. Just name the idea and maybe a couple of sentences about why you think that's one of the great ideas of Bucky. We're going to start with Joe. Joe.
Trim tab.
Trim tab. Why?
Yeah, I think that I think it's fascinating in the sense that how such a small object can actually created such great change, specifically within a boat in the Navy. So I think that, and then just the whole idea of leverage, how that factors into that as well.
Absolutely, it is an amazing idea of this one. So, Mike, idea please, an idea only.
Spaceship Earth. We all live in a yellow submarine. We're on a mission where no man has gone before, but they didn't tell us what that mission is.
Wonderful, wonderful. I love that. We went through operating manual for Spaceship Earth. Excellent. Next up is going to be Maritza.
So I've been grappling with how he speaks on integrity and courage. And I wasn't sure if that should be one topic or two, because I think they should go together, but that seems big, which is why I'm unsure about it.
Absolutely. No, I love it. I mean, that's a huge topic. All right. Anybody else wants to put any topic on the table? All right. So folks, I want to tell you about the meetups coming up. This is Comprehensivist Wednesdays. What we do is, for Comprehensivist Wednesdays, we do Mondays, we do improv. The first Wednesday is improv. Second Wednesday is Bucky's Great Ideas. Third Wednesday is neuroscience. And fourth Wednesday is some topic connected with language. We're starting a new series with Phil, and we're going to be talking about, I think, Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche on the fourth Sunday this time. We are also about to launch with Phil a series on the Great Plays. We're going to take, it's a very interesting series. It's going to start not this Sunday, but the Sunday after that. We're going to take a series of maybe about 6 to 7 plays, which span right from the Greek time to fairly modern time. We're going to select a collection of plays. All of them are going to be classics. So we're thinking of this time, we're thinking of Antigone by Euripides. Then we got Shakespeare. We're going to do Othello. We're going to do Saint Joan by George Bernard Shaw, Don Carlos by Schiller, El Cid by Corneille, and maybe 1 or 2 other plays. And we're going to be doing 1 play at a time, 2 weeks apart. So you get to, and play is very short. So it's not like a book where we need like 8 meetups. We can do the play in a single meetup, and you can read it within probably a couple of hours, 3 hours, something like that. So, and we're deliberately covering different cultures, different times, different sensibilities. And then once we're finished with this series, we will launch another series with a similar pattern to it. We'll choose a different theme, stuff like that. So that's a new series coming up. That our literature series, we've been doing Dante, Dostoevsky, and Goethe, and many other in that series. So that is morphing into these great plays, because what we thought is that this will allow us to commune with a lot more variety of literature within a year. So that's the new one coming up. As far as the weekly series goes, on Mondays, Maritza leads a poetry meetup. It's a very fascinating meetup. We do collaborative poetry. We read poems on a certain theme. You can read your own poems, and then we collaborate to create a poem on a certain theme. On Tuesdays, we've just launched Art of War, which is looking amazingly good, where Jason does his own translation for the group. People read translations that they have used, and then we discuss ideas chapter by chapter. Wednesdays are the Comprehensivist Wednesdays that we talked about. On Thursdays, we are doing Gospel of John. We are going through chapter 15. This time, tomorrow, I'm going to actually go into the Attic Greek to see what it actually means. I was completely blown away. I just looked at 4 sentences and only like 6 different words, and it's just incredible what you can see with these things. This Friday, we are doing, Brian, Penny, and Evanique are going to be doing Divine Feminine, and we are going to be looking at the Indian goddesses. Would love to have Evanique give maybe 1 or 2 minutes on that if you're up to it. So let's see. Yes, go ahead, Evanique.
Yeah, so we're going to be doing we're going to be studying Shaktism, and what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the 3 Indian goddesses that are part of, and similar to the Trinity and Christianity. I don't want to mispronounce the name off the top of my head, so I'm just going to say similar to the Trinity, and it's Parvati, Lakshmi, and I apologize, but the third one is just slipping my brain right now.
Sure.
And in addition, we're also going to be studying Kali, and we're also going to look at what Tantra really is according to the Indian philosophy. So it's different than what you're thinking of in Western philosophy. So we're going to study the Tantra and among other things about Indian culture. The one thing I do want to say though is that this is just, I'm thinking of this as just an introduction. So it's going to be a description of the goddesses, but it's not a deep dive. What I want to do is I want to take each goddess and do a deep dive in future series for the Divine Feminine. So So I was just thinking of that. And so that's the way I'm looking at it, like, you know, to do a deep dive into the goddesses, but to kind of just give a brief description to on Friday night. So
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And just to talk about Fridays. So Fridays also, we've got 4 different series going. On the first Friday, we do favorite verses from Tao Te Ching. On second Friday, we do Divine Feminine. Third Friday, we do Design Your Life. It's all about shaping your life. And fourth Friday, we do favorite ideas from Bhagavad Gita. So it's a comprehensivist program that we have. And I invite you to join whatever it is that you find interesting. And thank you so much. Thank you, Maritza. Thank you, Joe. Maritza, any closing thoughts? I'll give you the last word.
Okay. So I am going to shamelessly read from my notes here. Interconnectedness, reliance, responsibility, accountability. All of these things are aspects that we use when viewing precession. They are all things that are within, without, and around us. And so I invite everyone to view precession as something that exists. And it's just a matter of walking forward with intent, as I am wont to remind us that we should all do. And in doing so, be aware of what it is that you might not be seeing. It doesn't mean you're going to automatically see it, but that awareness is the first step to maybe seeing a little bit more. Thank you, guys.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
good night.